whether it was the South Pacific leaders who've been openly angry and contemptuous of the Morrison government's inability or failure to put their primary concern at the top of Australia's list, or whether it's at the other end, the biggest states as opposed to the smallest. So Morrison's trip last week to the US, where he was being pressured by the US and others, the Quad leaders as well, to do more on climate change and cutting emissions. All of this has come to a head, and it just happens to be at a time which, if any time was ever going to suit Morrison to bring to fruition this excruciatingly long and slow transition from lump of coal guy to global climate convert, is about as convenient for him as it could possibly get.
So when you talk about convenient for him, though, Peter, he hasn't given too many signals that he was going to break with the right rump and, of course, his national colleagues that have been so influential in the coalition over the last number of years in terms of climate change. Has he just played a different long game?
Well, he's been very cautious. There have been 5 Australian Prime Ministers who've lost their jobs now, where climate change has played at least a part in their demise, and Scott Morrison has no intention of being the 6th. So he's managed this very slowly, very carefully. There have been quite a few decisions under the radar. Well, not actually under the radar, they've been public, but where the government hasn't made a point of its own involvement. For example, where the state governments have created climate change initiatives and policies, the Morrison government has contributed billions of dollars to those state renewable energy plans. So there has been action, there has been commitment, but at the top level of making the big declarations and changing the really hard one, changing the 2030 targets, the government has not gone there. You're right, but there have been signals, and the most recent, was at the Quad Summit, where Morrison on the weekend sat down with Suga, the Prime Minister of Japan, Modi, Prime Minister of India, and Joe Biden. And they issued a joint statement after that meeting, recommitting themselves to the 1.5 degree of warming limit in the Paris Climate Agreement, and committing each of them to making renewed national offers before or at the Glasgow summit. So in that statement, as one of the Quad leaders, Morrison has committed to making a better national offer on emissions.
Yeah, and it is fascinating because that would be unusual, where the Quad becomes a forum for climate change. Our 2 biggest allies, which we've just signed the AUKUS deal with in the US and UK, are very robustly strong about these ambitions.
Yes, and when Scott Morrison sat down with Joe Biden last week for their bilateral, Biden had his climate change envoy, John Kerry, in the room with him. So it was pretty clear that was going to be a major item on the agenda there. And of course, Boris Johnson is the host of the Glasgow summit and has made a point publicly and privately of trying to get Scott Morrison to raise Australia's ambitions. What Morrison hasn't yet delivered, of course, is an agreement, a specific agreement with his coalition partner, the National Party. Morrison has been saying for months, in fact years now, that there's no point having a date and a number unless you've got a plan to get there. Well, of course, that puts the onus on him to come up with the plan. He is the planner in chief. So we've yet to see his plan. We've yet to see the specifics. We've yet to see him reassure the National Party to meet the Barnaby-Joyce test that nobody in the regions is going to lose a job over this. These are yet to be decided, presented, argued and finalised. And it was only a few weeks ago when I was interviewing Barnaby-Joyce. And I said, well, you're the Deputy Prime Minister. Where's the plan? And he said, well, if there is one, I'm not a party to it, and I need to see one. So Scott Morrison has been holding this very closely and moving very, very slowly and very cautiously on it. We'll see if he can land it. That's a test of his leadership. If he can't, that's a failure of his leadership, and it will be seen as a failure of Australia's on the world stage. And if I can just point out that Tony Abbott, when he set Australia's 2030 emissions targets of a 26 to 28% cut by 2030 over 2005 levels, that was the Abbott government target designed to match the Barack Obama target to keep Australia in sync with the US. Well, what Joe Biden has done has roughly doubled the US target to 50% cut of carbon emissions by 2030. So just to keep pace with what the US is doing, Australia now needs to get close to doubling its own 2030 effort. We haven't heard any specific confirmation about this from the federal government, but that would be just to keep pace with the US. And anything less than that will be seen as an extremely underwhelming and unimpressive performance by the US, by our neighbours, by just about the entire planet.
Yeah. And of course, our neighbours, as you pointed out earlier, the Pacific neighbours, have so much at stake. And it is interesting that Lowy is going to publish a very deep examination of aid to the region. And there really has been quite a dramatic fall at a time probably where they need it more than ever.
Yes, the Lowy survey of aid in the Pacific shows a couple of pretty interesting big picture trends. One is, as you say, there was a drop-off in aid donations, grants, loans, by 8 of the 10 biggest aid donors to the region. Australia, gratefully, was not one of those. Although Australia has cut aid elsewhere, Australian aid to the Pacific continues to rise. And over the last decade, Australia was by far the biggest single provider, with something like 42% of all aid to the South Pacific. But it does point to the need for Australia to step up its aid and other donors in the next 3 years, where the Lowy Institute says that the region will need multi-billion dollars extra over and above existing aid budgets to help the South Pacific nations recover from the devastating economic effects of having to shut their countries and close their tourism industries entirely, which is what they've done, when that's one of their biggest earners of foreign exchange and sources of employment.
And of also, surprisingly, China, we saw a very big fall off. Why? Because they have been so assertive in the region.
It is a surprise because China stepped up its aid budget to the South Pacific significantly, has made big efforts to recruit more countries diplomatically, to invest in them, to flatter them, and generally to increase its influence over them, trying to win over the South Pacific as a sphere of Chinese influence. So it is surprising, but the Lowy work shows that China's aid to the South Pacific has not only fallen by something like a third, but that it's also switched more away from grants to soft loans. In other words, it's got less generous, as well as getting smaller. And I don't know the reason for that. I don't think we've seen a policy explanation. But I'm looking forward to more detail in the Lowy Institute report, which we're going to see tomorrow.
Indeed. Good to talk, though, Pete. Thanks so much.
Pleasure, Bev.